Lauren Olamina, the fictional character whose journal entries serve as the text of Octavia Butler's 1993 novel, Parable of the Sower, would be 15 years old today. The story, which begins on Saturday, July 20th, 2024, centers on Lauren's experience living in Southern California during a version of the world that many have come to point out is chillingly close to our own. In Lauren's version of California, the world, rampant in economic inequality, climate change, and authoritarianism have created a society where virtually everyone except the wealthy few struggle to survive. The few communities that have found ways to support each other through mutual aid and rigorously disciplined resource cultivation are constantly being attacked by outsiders who have even less than them. There is a presidential candidate, Christopher Donner, who runs on a promise to return the United States to its former glory. No comment. When he is elected into office at the end of the year, he begins suspending worker and environmental protection laws and promotes investments in company towns, corporate-owned cities that exploit the astronomical unemployment and houselessness crises and bring back into mainstream practice the already legalized versions of indentured servitude and slavery. Now, Lauren, the daughter of a Black Baptist minister and former college professor, lives with what might be considered a disability, hyperempathy, the ability to experience the physical sensations she observes others experiencing, including physical symptoms like bleeding. She is also incredibly intelligent and curious. By the time we meet her in that first journal entry, she expresses, rightly so, deep skepticism of soon-to-be President Donner's promises that how returning to the way things were would fix the problems of the world. She has also begun to develop a clear and visionary set of beliefs for herself, having secretly abandoned the Baptist faith of her father, which she eventually comes to call Earthseed. The destiny of Earthseed, she writes, in an entry dated Sunday, July 20th, 2025, is to take root among the stars. And she means this literally. As part of her faithful belief that change is both inevitable and essential for humanity, she envisions that there will come a time when humanity, because of our actions, will have no choice but to find a new home beyond Earth. What that home looks like? Well, that's up to us. And maybe we get a little bit of a sneak peek in the sequel text Parable of the Talents that Butler released in 1998. Now, I'm not here to give a book report on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, but there is a reason why I felt compelled to bring it into this space of community worship and reflection today. In 2004, when asked about the chillingly predictive nature of her two parable texts, Octavia Butler stated that when I wrote them, the time was very different. I was trying not to prophesize. Matter of fact, I was trying to give warning. In her writings, Butler astutely observed the cyclical nature of humanity, that there were patterns of behavior that we could identify from our past and intentionally try to work to prevent in our present so that we didn't relive them in potentially more horrific ways in our future. She goes on to say in that same 2004 interview, one of the kinds of research I did was to read a lot of stuff about World War II. And not the war itself, but I wanted to know in particular how a country goes fascist. So I have this country in Parable of the Sower, and especially Parable of the Talents, sliding in that direction. And I really was not trying to prophesize that somehow we would do that. Take a breath. 30 years ago, Butler imagined what our world would look like if we repeated the patterns of our past without making true and lasting change to how we engage with each other and our world. She may not have wanted to prophesize, but the unfortunate reality is, in that many ways, she did. We know that authoritarianism is on the rise. Climate change has continued to create deadly crises for communities around the world, and our refusal to engage in any real critique or even minor shifts away from capitalism as a globalized economic structure have led to a wealth inequality that is downright evil. In 2023, the top 1% of the world's wealthiest population owned 38% of the world's wealth. The bottom 50% of the population, 2%. And it should come as no surprise that when you factor in characteristics such as race and gender, the impact of not just wealth inequality, but the rise in authoritarianism and climate crises becomes breathtakingly and immorally worse for women and people of color. I imagine for some of us, this isn't new information, and maybe in this moment it isn't alleviating any of the feelings of uncertainty or rage or even despair we may have already come into this space with because, like me this morning, we made the mistake of doom scrolling through the headlines of the last few days. And if I'm being honest, it shouldn't. These are turbulent and even terrifying times. We need to be honest about our reality and how we feel about it, because that is the only way we are going to be able to claim any of our responsibility and our power to change that reality for the better. But here's the good news. Lauren Olamina's fictional story and our real one also predicts that. See, just like the harmful and dangerous patterns in humanity we can so easily identify in today's world, Octavia Butler's parables also invites us and encourages us to find the liberating and life-giving ones that are seated not just within Lauren's story, but our own as well. Without re-entering book report mode, we can find many of those invitations in what Lauren writes in her journal as some of those core teachings of Earthseed, and especially her central assertion that God is change. Lauren combines her difficult and honest assessment about the atrocities of society with something we all have: imagination. She knows that in this moment in her life, in humanity's life, a change is going to come. But what that change looks like, we get to decide. Rather than be resigned to a change that continues the extractive or exploitative, the downright deadly patterns of the past, Lauren imagines what a change could look like if it was shaped by the best of who we are as a people: compassion, care, curiosity, generosity. I'm going to try something and go off book. Who's got another one? Heart opening. Kind. Love. You took my punchline. I'll take it. Generous. Inclusive. Diverse.
Did you hear love?
Yes, that was the punchline I had at the end of my list. I'll say it again. Love. It's worth repeating. Gentle. Less judgmental. Say that one more time. Welcoming. Folks online, if you want to type it in the chat, maybe we can see what you're thinking later on. What was that? Calming. Just take a beat. Connected. Feel that. Understanding. Feel that. Imagine that world. Lauren dares to imagine that it is not just her and our shared responsibility to create that change. It is well within our capacity to do so. For the sake of change, let's revisit that excerpt that served as our reading today in a new way and read that earthseed portion backwards. God is change. God, change, exists to be shaped. Clay, chaos, teacher, trickster. God is pliable, and yet indifferent, inexorable, irresistible, infinite. God, change, is power. Rather than avoid or deny that change can and will happen, we can and must decide what we are going to do to shape that change. How are we going to claim our power to change now with forethought and intention, before the conditions of the world force us to change out of fear and desperation? How are we going to lean into the honest and sometimes painful realities of the world as it is, so that we can leap into the beautiful and still yet imagined possibilities of the world as it could be? And how do we, as Unitarian Universalists, people of a faith that prides itself on being a living tradition, that celebrates the ways in which we as individuals and communities are continuously shaped by our journeys, that lifts up transformation as an essential part of our values? How are we both responsible for and empowered to help steward that change? Here's some more good news. We've done it before. In the midst of all that is happening in our world, not the least of which is an international reality of multiple genocides and escalating global warfare, we are constantly being told that we are living through unprecedented times. But I have to be honest, every time I hear that, a piece of my soul resists that. And I've realized, I've come to decide it's only because that's partially true. Now, to be clear, I'm not in any way denying that the combination of elements that make up our shared and individual experiences is new. Of course it is. There are technological, geopolitical, psychological, biological, name your ogical or itical. They're all new and unique to this moment in history. Some of these realities, like our more mainstream awareness of intergenerational trauma, invites us to live into our better selves. Some of them, like artificial intelligence, maybe requires a little bit more discipline to use ethically. But what I am suggesting is that at the root of our unprecedented times, there are also realities that are quite precedented. After all, Octavia's parables wouldn't have been so eerily accurate if there wasn't some form of repetition. Realities like dehumanization, rooted in racism and white supremacy. Exploitation, rooted in a belief that humanity is a superior creation. Isolation, rooted in a violent disregard of our inherent connections. Division, rooted in the manipulation of a fear of difference. Extermination, rooted in an oppressively false definition of safety. In their text, Let This Radicalize You, Organizing and the Revolution of Reciprocal Care, abolitionist organizers and educators Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba invite us to remember that there have been other moments in history, periods of tremendous grief and immeasurable suffering, when those most impacted by them still dared to imagine, hope, and shape change. In their chapter, Hope and Grief Can Coexist, they write, Many of our ancestors experienced the end of the world as they had known. During times of siege and enslavement, amid open warfare and famine, behind bars and while living as fugitives, and with the threat of nuclear annihilation looming overhead, previous generations have found ways to organize for change and collective survival. We must learn from their histories and traditions as we face an uncertain future. Those realities that are in fact precedented, we have seen and directly benefit from. How our ancestors and elders moved through them with courage and vision when they encountered them before. In another text, Healing Justice Lineages, Dreaming at the Crossroads of Liberation, Collective Care, and Safety, Kara Page and Erica Woodland trace dozens of these movements in history and their long-standing impact. Movements like the American Indian Movement, founded in 1968, that was initiated by indigenous men incarcerated in the U.S. prison industrial complex, who brought national attention to the various forms of systemic oppression that have been impacting indigenous communities for centuries, including poverty, police brutality, cultural genocide, and more. Through various direct actions like the occupation of Alcatraz in San Francisco, Wounded Knee in South Dakota, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs in DC, they called attention to the ongoing implications of settler colonialism in the United States. And through the creation of the AIM Patrol, the Indian Health Board, and survival schools, they also imagined and developed alternatives that could become the seeds for a world with indigenous sovereignty and collective care. And it's not just the people and movements in our past that we can learn from. As Hayes and Kaba write, we can also learn from organizers among us today who face seemingly insurmountable odds and find ways to move forward in hope. We can and must learn from the people in our own communities today who are on the front lines of imagination, who daily discern whether they will need to shape change with intention or desperation. Kaba and Hayes also highlight people in communities like Chicago's Little Village, a predominantly Hispanic community who in April of 2020 faced a community-wide environmental and health crisis when a decommissioned coal stack was improperly demolished and a giant toxic dust cloud swept through their community. The immediate and ongoing implications for community members' health and their environment were devastating and deadly. And the organizers who leaned into that reality were able to, as Kaba and Hayes put it, wage acts of transformational care. The Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, LVEJO, we all love our acronyms, had already been organizing for years to combat environmental racism that the community had been experiencing. And in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're now faced with even more challenges following this dust cloud. And so together with a coalition that included individuals impacted in the Cook County Jail, they organized a community-wide car caravan that provided both widespread political education and called upon city leadership to literally clean up their act. On top of these demonstrations, they leaned into the dangers of their reality and leapt into the possibility of what the best of humanity could do to change it, creating vibrant mutual aid structures in Little Village that work to provide the most impacted community members with water, food, asthma inhalers and medication, transportation, COVID tests, and more. As LVE organizer Juliana Pino shared with Kaba and Hayes, our work happens in opposition to what is likely or what others in power think will happen. I think remembering that allowed us to push back the hopelessness and to find each other as people committed to work and community in that sort of relational space. And that's where we found the energy to fight back. To paraphrase from what was beautifully sung earlier in this service, but we're gonna be okay. as long as we're beside each other along the way. If we hold on to these wisdoms and allow our ability to shape change, to be shaped by them, there is no limit to what we can both imagine and create together. It will not be easy. It will not be quick. We will not transform centuries of dangerous and harmful patterns overnight. But it will be possible and it will be powerful. If we intentionally build in practices that remind us of who we are and what we value. If we purposefully make the time to connect to each other, hello, my friends on Zoom. If we faithfully support one another with a culture of care and a prioritization of our collective sustainability. We may or may not find ourselves living among the literal stars, like Lauren imagined. But we can imagine for ourselves a different world and truly claim our ability to make it real. And then maybe, one day, like Homer, the caterpillar turned butterfly, we will take off into the sky, up towards the bright moon, bold as a bird, to who knows where.